Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about evaluating evidence. It's a topic that I'm really excited to share with you. Let me just give you a little bit of a reason why we're doing this. I get questions all the time from people who want to know, why the tombstone says this, but the draft card says this, or I found a death record that has this information, but this other piece of documentation that I have written in the family Bible says something entirely different. That's going to happen in genealogy. The evidence that we collect as we look for our family stories can be messy. It can be confusing. It can be conflicting. Very, very rarely do all the little pieces of information we collect line up perfectly with the name always being in the same order. I have relatives that like to switch their middle and given names, the first and last names a lot. Very rarely are we going to find the names always in the same order, spelled the same way, the age exactly right, the dates exactly correct. Sometimes even we end up with incorrect parents' names on certain pieces of information. And so today, what I want to do, my objective for today is just to share with you some basic questions you can start to ask yourself as you look at the documentation that you're collecting as you try to grow your family tree. This is a really just kind of a beginner look at evaluating evidence. I don't want to overwhelm anybody, but especially for those of you who are new to genealogy, these are questions you need to start asking yourself, because what's going to happen is you're going to have to make a decision. You're going to attach information to your tree. You're going to put information into your family tree maker program about here's the name or here's the birth date or here's the death date. And you're going to have to make a decision in order to do that. And that decision, sometimes, if it's made incorrectly, can create brick walls for you when you're doing your research. So, you may have made a decision to put the name in this way or to put a date in this way, and now you can't figure out why you can't go back any further. Well, maybe it's because you made a poor choice down here based on how you looked at the evidence that you had. I hope that makes sense. As I said, my objective today is just to kind of open your eyes and get you thinking about some of the questions that you should be asking yourself as you get engaged in this amazingly fun adventure. It makes it just that much more like a detective ferreting out clues and evaluating the evidence as you discover it. So I know that was a lengthy introduction, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about. So let's dive in. Which source do I believe? That's the question that I get asked in the way that I get asked it most often. And so let me just give you some questions back, some questions that you should be asking yourself every time you look at a record. Now, keep in mind here that I'm actually talking about records. I'm not talking about family trees. Family trees are great clues, but they are not actual records. And so let me just throw this out there. This is an adage that is often repeated in the genealogy community, which is that genealogy without documentation is mythology. If you can't tell me where you got a piece of information or why you believe something is true, then how do I know that it's true? How do I know that you didn't just make it up, or that the person who you copied it from, or the person they copied it from, or the person they copied it from didn't just make that information up, or wasn't just guessing? So documentation is what helps us ensure that we're climbing the right trees, that we're connecting with people who really are our ancestors, not just random people or made up people. And as sad as it is to say, that does happen. And then another thing to keep in mind as we start looking at some of these questions is that all sources are not created equal. Clearly, a family tree that somebody puts online that has absolutely no documentation attached to it is very different than holding a family Bible in your hands and looking at it yourself and coming to some conclusions. Lots of different places on that scale, and that's what we're going to start to look at today. So here is the first question that I do ask myself all the time. It's become pretty automatic for me, but hopefully it's something that you can start to think about. The question is, am I looking at an index or the original record? And when I say original record, I include images, digital images of those original records. So one of the things that we've discovered here at Ancestry.com is that some people don't understand the difference. And that's fine. If you're brand new to genealogy, this is a lot of information and sometimes it can be a little overwhelming. And so let me just show you what I mean. When I am looking for a family member, and let's just use the census as an example because it's a good, simple example that we're all familiar with. Let me make a little bit more screen room here. When I look at a census record, what I'm looking at right here is what we call the index page. Basically what this is that a person has gone in and typed up what they have read on that record. And you can see here just right away, there are two interpretations of what that last name might be. And so unless you actually view the original record, you're looking at somebody else's interpretation of what it says. And like I said, a lot of people who come to our website don't understand the difference between an index and the original record. I would encourage you to always look at the original record. If it's on our website, you can view it here, and where we are allowed, where the content providers and the archives and the government agencies that share these records with us, where they allow us to where they allow us to post original images, we do. Sometimes they don't allow that, and so you have to actually use the information on the index to contact the archive or the repository to get a copy of that original record. But if it's available here, always view it. If it's not available here, oftentimes you'll see a little link over here that'll allow you to order it, or if you read down here in the database description, there might be mailing information about where you can contact that archive or repository to get an original record. So that's the first question. Are you looking at an index or are you looking at the original record? The closer you can get to that original record, the better, because the less people it's been filtered through, the less chance there is of there being errors, mistakes, misunderstandings. Original records aren't always perfect, however, and so there's some additional questions we need to ask. One is, when was this record created? So I was just looking yesterday at a tombstone, and the death date, right, which you would think that would be the most accurate thing on a tombstone, but the death date didn't match any of the other information that I had found that recorded the death date. Well, when I called the cemetery, come to find out that tombstone had actually been created 17 years after that guy had died. So he had died. When he had died, I don't know if they placed a temporary tombstone or not, but there was no tombstone placed. And then apparently the family got together enough money or whatever the circumstance and was able to purchase a tombstone. 17 years later, somebody's writing down the information to be carved on that tombstone, and they got the death date wrong. The day was off by like 3 days and the year was off by 2. So when that record was created, when was that tombstone carved? When, was the birth record recorded the day the child was born? Or was it recorded when the child was 8 years old? Or, when the child was 5 and needed to get into school? Or when the child was 18 and needed to get into the military and a delayed birth certificate was created? Think about that and dig into that sometimes. When was the record created? Where was the record created? That's also important. Think about maybe census records as an example. Census records were created. I'm sorry, I'm going to apologize right now just for all the throat clearing. We've got the worst air quality in the country right now here because of some winter inversion, and so it's just really, I'm over my cold, but it's messing with my throat and my voice. Think about where that record was created. The census records were created by a census taker standing on a porch or sitting in a living room or standing in a field talking to a member of the household or maybe a neighbor and filling out the form that he had in this book. Think about, was the birth record created in the hospital, or was the birth record created in a clerk's office 2 weeks later? Start to think about that. Start to dig into that. Start to look for clues that will help you answer these questions, because all of these questions are going to help you determine which sources to believe or which sources to give more credence to. Think about why the record was created. As amazing as these records are for genealogy and for tracing our family history, that is not the reason most records were created. I think family Bibles may be one of the only exceptions where a family was recording the events in their lives for the purpose of their posterity. Most other records were not created with genealogists in mind, or even considered at all. Military records, draft cards are a great example. Those were created because there was a war going on and because we needed to have all the men registered so that we knew who was eligible to serve in that conflict and then to be eligible for that draft. Census records are created because it's constitutional and because we need to count the people and make sure that we have adequate resources and representation for the people. Those records are not created for the purpose of genealogy. And so sometimes if we think about that, it might change the way we look at the record a little bit. And then this is a question that I ponder often, and sometimes there is an answer and sometimes there's not. Who provided the information? So in the case of the tombstone yesterday that I was looking for, when I contacted the cemetery, they actually had information about who had filled out the form to have the tombstone created. They knew who the informant was, and the informant was a son. It was one of his younger sons, but it was a son. On death certificates, I always look to see who the informant is. I want to know who provided that information. If it's a daughter-in-law, which I've seen, maybe she didn't really know the names of her father-in-law's parents. Maybe that's why those names on that death certificate don't match anything else I've found. Maybe she only knew her father-in-law's second wife and didn't realize that that wasn't his mother. Again, think about who provided that information. On the 1940 census, we're really lucky because there's a little X with a circle next to the name of the person who answered the census taker's questions. So we can tell, if nobody in the household has an X by it, maybe it was one of the neighbors. Well, no wonder the birth years are terribly off. If it was, the teenage son, well, no wonder the parents' birth or ages are wrong. He didn't know exactly how old they were. So where the information is provided, who the informant was, that can educate our decisions about, again, how much credence to give this piece of evidence or not. So let's just look at a few more examples. I've given you some as we have gone, but let me just make sure we're all thinking kind of along the same lines. When we look at census records specifically, one of the phrases that I hear a lot from people is, well, on the census, he said he was 27 years old. And that's really not the right way to phrase that. And that may seem like a semantics issue, but the bottom line is if we talk like that, we start to think like that. You don't know that he's the one who told the census taker he was 27 years old. It could have been anybody in that household or anybody in the neighborhood who provided that information. So you can't say, well, he told the census taker he was born in Poland, or he told the census taker he immigrated to the United States in 1881, because you don't know who provided that information. So census records, while they are foundational to genealogy research, while they are excellent resources for helping us understand migration patterns and where people lived and when they lived there and family structure and even ages and birthplaces, they're great clues and insights and evidence of those things. But remember, the person who provided the information was not always the person whose information is on the sheet. Okay, let's talk about birth records for just a minute. Birth record, this is going to sound funny. It always sounds funny when I say it. Nobody creates their own birth record, right? So you were present at your birth, but chances are you had nothing to do with filling out your birth certificate, right? unless you have a delayed birth certificate because you were trying to get into the military or trying to get ID. There are cases of that where the person years later needed identification, and in order to get identification, they had to get a birth certificate. Well, they never had a birth certificate because the state they were born in didn't start keeping birth certificates until 1917, and so they get what's called a delayed birth certificate by providing evidence and affidavits from others who were present or knew about their birth, and then they can get a delayed birth certificate. But for the most part, most of us don't fill out our own birth certificate. However, that information tends to be more accurate than not, depending on how close to the event it was created. Now, of course, there are always exceptions. My grandfather, we think, was born on the 2nd of October. He was born in the backwoods of northwest Arkansas, and the doctor didn't actually come around for another 2 weeks. And the doctor recorded the birth date. And when he said, well, when was the baby born? They said, well, we think he was born on the 4th. And so my grandfather's birth was recorded as the 4th of October by the state, but in the family Bible it's recorded as the 2nd of October. And based on what we've been able to figure out, we think what happened was somebody in the household, we don't know who, provided the incorrect date based on their best memory 2 weeks later. So think about that. Now let me just give you another caution about birth records, particularly as it relates to birth records you find on Ancestry.com. And this is true for marriage records and death records as well, and it has to do with this concept of an index. So in the card catalog, this is one of the ways in which I search. So if you're new to the site and you haven't used the card catalog, I would encourage you to do that. You're just going to hover over search, and it's going to be the bottom option there. And oftentimes I'll come in here and I'll click on birth, marriage, and death, and I'll click on birth, and I'll click on U.S., and maybe I'll even drill down to a specific state or a specific time period. And what I'm looking for specifically is just to see what records are available online. That's how I use the card catalog. Now, when I find a database that I might be interested in, so say, for example, this is Massachusetts Town and Vital Records from 1620 to 1988. The towns in Massachusetts kept amazing, amazing records. And then this couple, the Holbrooks, actually spent years going from town to town. I think they visited 315 out of the state's 351 towns to microfilm these records. It's just this amazing collection of records. And all of that information is written here in this database description. So one of the ways that we can evaluate the validity of the records that we're looking at is to read these database descriptions when we find a collection we're interested in. Look and see, when was the record created? Why was the record created? What information is included in the record, right? Additionally, this collection has images. So it's not just an index, it actually has images attached. However, you'll notice over here, some of these images are indexes. Okay, now I don't want to confuse things too much, but let me just show you what I mean by that. So if I come in here and I come to image 23, and you probably can't see this real clearly, but I would encourage you to play around with it a little bit. This is a handwritten index that was created some years after the events that occurred. And so even though there's an image here, this image is a handwritten index that was created years later. And again, is subject to the interpretation of the people who were looking at those records. So it can help you get closer to the original, and that's what we use those indexes for. But you'll notice here we have actual birth, marriage, and death records, several volumes of them for that location. So there's an index to help you get closer to the original. There are original records as well. Pay attention to that. As you look at databases, always look at the database title and look at the database description. You'll notice, for example, North Carolina, all we have are the indexes. They're from 1800 to 2000, that's great, but they're just indexes. California births, just indexes. And so while the information in California, in the California birth records are amazing, Again, it's just somebody's interpretation. There's an example right here that I use often. This is my grandfather. It lists his birth date correctly. It lists his birth county correctly. However, his mother's maiden name on this index is listed as Nonels, Nonels. Her maiden name was actually Noack, Noack. Now, if you know anything about how handwriting works, you know that an A and an N sometimes can look alike if the letter isn't closed off correctly. E's and C's sometimes look alike. A K could look like an L and an S. So I can completely see how somebody could look at a record and see Nonels from Noack. However, if I hadn't known her maiden name, and I do because I knew her personally, but if I hadn't known her maiden name, I could have taken this as the gospel truth, put that into my database, and then wondered why I could never find a Lillian Nonels in any other record anywhere else. So you have the opportunity here to either order the original document, and that's because the state hasn't allowed us to have those. They've only given us an index. Or if you click on this database description here, you can see that we obtained this set of records from the State of California Department of Health Services. You could then visit their website, and there's a link here in the database description, to order directly from them rather than through this other service, directly from them a copy of that original record so that you can look at it for yourself and make that decision. That becomes really critical when some indexer somewhere, and in this case it's the state of California, has made an error or has incorrectly interpreted a record. So those are my cautions about birth records. Similar cautions about marriage records. I would add, don't just pay attention to whether you're looking at an index or an original. Pay attention to whether you're looking at a marriage license or a marriage register or return. I've had people where I've looked at trees and I've seen, they have them married 2 and 3 times, and I know for a fact they were only married once. Well, it's because they were actually engaged previously, and they got a marriage license, and that marriage license popped up in a database, but there was no attached return, so they didn't actually go through with the wedding. So pay attention to what you're looking at. Is it a marriage license or is it a marriage return? Military records. Just one brief caution, particularly about military records in the World War I draft card database. I just got a question yesterday. The birth year is off. We have discovered that the birth year on World War I draft cards is very, very frequently off by 1 year. The day and month almost always match, but the year is almost always off by 1 year. Sometimes one way, sometimes the other way. There's lots of reasons for that. Maybe the young man wasn't quite 18 yet, but with his patriotic fervor and all of that surrounding the war, wanted to register for the draft anyway, and so he up-aged himself. Maybe on the other end of it, if he was too old for the draft and he still wanted to participate, he down-aged himself. Maybe he just told the person that was the draft registrar how old he was, and then the draft registrar figured out the birth year and miscalculated. But lots of different record sets have different little quirks like that. And the more you read those database descriptions and maybe Google about or learn a little bit more about the records, the more likely you are to come closer to the truth as you're evaluating that evidence. And then the final just kind of broad category that I want to warn you about or encourage you to look more into are tombstones. Find a Grave is an excellent resource, and there are thousands and thousands of wonderful, wonderful volunteers all over the country who are tromping through cemeteries and taking pictures of tombstones and uploading those tombstones to Find a Grave and seeing that that information is transcribed correctly. But again, always try to look at the original image of the tombstone. Don't just take the transcription or the index as gospel. And in the case of what I discovered yesterday, look at the cemetery, and if possible, call the cemetery. In this case, the cemetery had additional information about when the tombstone was purchased, when I discovered it was purchased 17 years later, and who the informant had been, that educated my decision about what information was accurate or inaccurate. And cemetery, you can contact the cemetery. Sometimes they have more information. Sometimes they'll have clippings of obituaries, copies of death certificates, all sorts of really great information. So always use information that you find to lead you to other information. And that just brings me to my last few words of advice today. There are some additional questions that I start to ask myself after I start collecting all these pieces. Maybe I've got a census record and a tombstone and a draft card and a marriage license, and every piece of that information I look at and I ask these questions. Does this support or contradict the information I already have? If it contradicts it, I need to figure out why, or what the possible reasons are why. Is there independent information, or does it all come from the same source? If I'm looking at 2 or 3 census records that all say the same thing, that doesn't mean that those 3 things are accurate and the death certificate is wrong. Maybe the 3 censuses, maybe it was his wife that filled that information out, and she thought, she always thought he immigrated in this year and he was born in this place. And then, maybe it was his mother or his sister that was the informant on the death certificate, and maybe she knew something that his wife didn't, or vice versa. So just because multiple pieces of information have the same, multiple documentation has the same information, doesn't give it more weight, right? You have to think about who provided that information. Think about how strong the evidence is that you've collected. I ask this question often. Does what I've collected really support what I believe? Is this really who his parents are? Are there more questions that I could ask? And that's kind of the last question. Do I have doubts, right? Do I suspect? Is there some niggling something in my head that's saying, you know what, I don't know that that's quite right, or I remember hearing something a little bit different. Are there holes? Am I missing 30 years worth of censuses? 3 entire censuses. Maybe I have a census when he first got married and a census right before he died. Have I collected all the rest of them? Are there other records that I should be looking for? Maybe I have a death record. Have I gotten a copy of the obituary from the newspaper? Maybe I have a draft card or an enrollment record into the military. Have I gone to the National Archives to see if I can get his military service file or a pension file? All of those, as I look at all of the records that I've collected and all of the evidence that I've collected, that last question really is what keeps me going forward in family history, keeps me filling in those holes, helps me to keep telling that story, helps me to keep shoring up that information so that I know that what I'm building is an accurate tree, that what I'm building is really the story of my family, not mythology or some random piece of information. I also find that I run into brick walls a lot less as I take the time to collect and evaluate evidence as I go. Well, that's all we have time for today. I hope that this was a good introduction for you. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions. Maybe just kind of sit with this information a little bit, let it ruminate in your head. Maybe watch the video again, make sure you write down some of these questions, try out what you've learned, and then of course if you have additional questions, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can ask those questions in the comments. We do respond to those. Or you can email me at ask@ancestry.com. If I get a lot of the same questions, maybe I'll do a part 2 to this presentation, or create a new presentation that'll address those specific questions. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.